Kim Penberthy is a professor of psychiatry and neurobehavioral sciences at the University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies. Some of her main research interests include consciousness, anomalous cognition, the mind-brain relationship, and psychology at the end of life. She's passionate about mindfulness and meditation, and their ability to enhance the performance and abilities of humans. Please see the description for timestamps, a reading list, and much more. So Kim, please can you briefly talk through your background and how you ended up at Virginia DOPS, the Division of Perceptual Studies?
Yes, well, it has been an interesting route there. So I will say I went into psychology because it was something that was really interesting to me. And I've come to DOPS from sort of a traditional psychology background, a clinical psychology background, and spent my early career really researching the mechanisms of action of interventions of like psychotherapy, and looking at, what is it about the psychotherapeutic interventions that actually helps. That was really very interesting to me. And through that, I really enjoyed learning about the different psychotherapies because, to do the mechanism of action, what makes this work, you have to sort of know the therapeutic approach. You have to understand it very thoroughly. And so I got to learn all these different psychotherapies and began to see, commonalities and themes in what helped things work and what seemed to have an impact. And along the way was introduced to things like meditation and mindfulness as they became more empirically researched and studied, and really got excited about that because I saw that seemed to be one of the sort of commonalities, this sort of ability to help people learn to be present and to access just the present moment in order to then do whatever the next thing was that might be more effective. And that led me into mindfulness research and meditation research. And in a way, it was really exciting because it brought me sort of full circle to some of my first passions before I even started studying psychology, which were more spiritual, more about sort of the strange aspects of humanity and the sort of transcendental experiences. So early on, my father and mother were very open-minded, very huge readers. My dad was a cardiothoracic surgeon and my mother an intensive care nurse. And I heard a lot about what they did, the stories they told, the incredible aspects of death and dying in addition to healing. And they introduced me to people like the authors that sort of impacted me, I guess. So Emanuel Friedenberg, who really early on, reading that as a young person was just sort of mind-boggling. I had never expected, Christians could be mystics. And so understanding this, I was raised as a Methodist, and seeing this other aspect was really exciting to me. And so through things like that, and being exposed to these ideas that were sort of spanning the science and the spiritual. So I remember one really formative thing, even early on. I was a very inquisitive child and grew up in West Virginia out on a farm. So was just out in nature all the time and exploring and asking a lot of questions and exposed early on. If you live that way, you're exposed early on to life and death, and you start to ask questions. And if you're allowed to, it's wonderful. So I remember asking my mother and father separately, what was the purpose of life? So this occurred to me, like, I see life and death, and what's the purpose? And my father said, "Oh, that's easy." And I was like, "Really? Great. What is it?" And he said, it's to reproduce. Life is created because it needs to create more life. Yeah. Okay, very scientific sort of understanding. Yeah. And then I was like, okay, there you go. And then I asked my mom, what is the purpose of life? And she said, oh, that is so easy. It's love. And so I got these two answers. And I thought, well, that was pretty good. I thought it went well. So I think I'll try my next question later on. What happens when you die?
Yeah.
And again, my father said it's quite easy. I'm sure you can guess what he said. He explained the dying process and the decomposition process of what happens when you literally die. So I got that again. Okay, very interesting. And then I asked my mother, and she said again, that's easy. You're reunited with wherever you came from. It's a release, back. And so I had that in my mind early on, and I think that helped me sort of see that we don't really know everything, and it made me very curious to learn more. That it could be both, and I wanted to know more about each one. So that led to exactly what I talked about at first, that I developed this interest in psychology. I actually majored in psychology and biology at Wake Forest University, which is here in North Carolina in the US, and had some excellent teachers, and really was allowed again to expand with philosophy and to read more, and just really develop this curiosity. And that led me eventually to DOPS. I was at the University of Virginia doing we have what's called a fellowship, sort of the more advanced training in clinical psychology, and doing my research in these mechanisms of action, looking at mindfulness and the contemplative components. What is it about mindfulness or meditation that really helps you achieve these changes? And through that work became involved with DOPS and started growing that aspect of the work we do there, and have also gotten into other components that are incredibly interesting to me, including the after-death communications and near-death experiences that people report. I have been not only in the psychiatry department as a researcher and a clinician, I'm also in our cancer center. So I work with people who, along the whole spectrum. So people who have cancer and most likely are going to be able to get treatment and get better. And then also with palliative care and hospice, individuals are looking at the end of their life. And so looking at fear of death and dying, after-death communications, the experiences that these entire families and family systems have around their family member who's dying have been so, I've been so honored to be able to do that work clinically, and to develop more of my work in that arena, in the research area.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's fascinating. There's a lot there.
It's so fascinating. I mean, I wish, I hope I have a long, long life, because I have a lot to read and study and explore.
Yeah. There's so much out there to get to and to learn about.
It's true.
We're going to circle back to some of those things as well in there.
Absolutely.
Like definitely, firstly, I was going to ask you when you first kind of realized that maybe physicalism doesn't, explain necessarily our reality. But I think maybe it makes more sense for me to ask you the other way now, because you said you were very open-minded from an early age and you kind of were brought up in that way. So have you ever along your journey doubted whether there is more to it, or whether it is just, just material, just physical? Have you ever had your doubts?
Not really. I think I've been curious all along. I'm reading a book now, Sapiens.
I haven't read it.
You've read that or heard of it?
I haven't read it, but I've heard of it. Yeah.
And it's a series, and it's been very interesting because it is about the evolution of humankind, of man. And it's making me sort of, I like it because it's making me sort of think about things in a different way, about, what really does separate us from animals, from your dog, your pet dog, or the deer out in the fields or whatever. And I'm just curious about that as well. If we have this sort of similarity in our biological basis with all the other creatures here on this earth, and yet we're different. What does that mean? Is it and Sapiens is really talking about how important the culture is, and our ability as a Homo sapiens that differentiated us from the other Homo sort of branches. Our ability is this ability to imagine, to think about the future, or imagine, and that through that we developed cultures that build systems, and it's those systems that allow us to do things together collectively. A belief in something like, we believe in democracy, so we have this thing called the Constitution, and we all agree and we all sort of comply. Animals don't do that. Or if they do any kind of group work like ants or something, it's sort of pre-programmed in their DNA. So it's very interesting to me to say, well, what does that mean then?
Yeah.
It is so, and it could go either way, right? I mean, it could go, oh, so this is all sort of cultural and it's all our imagination and fantasy, or it means that we're tapping into something completely different. Or we're tapping into the same thing the deer and our pet dogs are. We're just somehow thinking about it differently.
Yeah.
Or able to conceptualize it with our brains that work differently,
Yeah, because it could be, the brain, maybe they still have like a consciousness, but maybe its brain is the difference potentially.
And it could be, again, that our filter is different than theirs,
Yeah.
And so what does that mean then? It means, yes, physical matters. And it may also mean that there is this other realm that does exist. It's just a matter of how can you access it, or awareness of it, I guess. It's there. So it's not like it's either not there or there. It is, so I don't know if that's making any sense or not, but that has added, I guess, another layer to the way I think about things is, and it does quite nicely sort of fit into, why do some of us seem to have an ability to access these transcendental states or this knowledge, and some have more, some have less, and the fact that you can also sort of seem to acquire some of that ability through the act of meditations or different breathing techniques, or contemplative practices, is really interesting to me.
Yeah, definitely.
I really began looking at that, in part because working at the Division of Perceptual Studies, I've been so honored to work with so many brilliant people who study things like children who remember past lives and near-death experiences. And what occurred to me, as I'm sure has occurred to other people, is that not all of us are going to have those experiences. And what a shame it is, because we see the therapeutic effect of having those experiences. We see how it can positively transform people's lives, and how nice it would be if we can do that on purpose, if we can intentionally help people move in that direction. And so that's where, as a clinician, I think that really is the first thing that comes to my mind. Yes, it's interesting these are happening, and we do need to do research and compile data. And I think of the so what question is what I call it. So what if we know all of that? How do we use that? How can we help mankind, help our planet, help, and I really do believe that through these contemplative practices and an increasing ability to access those, teach those to people, that we can change, humanity and change the world potentially.
Yeah, well, we need to, so I hope it'll work. Can you talk a little bit more about those contemplative, how do I say it?
I say contemplative.
Contemplative.
That rolls off my tongue easier, but I'm sure there's multiple ways to pronounce it.
Yeah, I would normally contemplative or something. I would probably say normally, but you threw me off with your different one. But it's fine. That
works too.
But talk to me more about that and the mindfulness stuff, and
Sure.
tell me some of these techniques and why it's so important and the benefits. Just kind of take
Absolutely.
it away.
And this is not unique, the work I'm doing. Fortunately, more and more people are doing this research and really exploring what was started, I think, in the West by people like Jon Kabat-Zinn, who developed the mindfulness-based stress reduction. It's been around for ages. And so I do like to make sure and pause and remember that indigenous cultures, that have practiced these things for thousands of years. So it's nothing new. I think we have a bad habit in the Western culture, especially the US, of thinking we invented it and taking ownership of it and dissecting it and studying it and making it very sterilized. And so I want to make sure we acknowledge that this is not new. It's been done for thousands of years. Practices to help alter the state of consciousness. That's really what we're talking about, is an altered state of consciousness. And it can be achieved through a variety of ways. And so that's what I'm talking about, is achieving it through these intentional practices of meditation, of breathing techniques, of sort of really focusing, your attention on what you wish to focus on. So that's sort of the more sterilized version that we use in clinical psychology. And, we use it because we can manipulate it and control it and study it in a systematic way that's amenable to a randomized controlled trial. So from that medical clinical perspective, that's why we do them that way. So those are the kind of studies I've looked at, where we intentionally are trying to take people who may have not been exposed to this before and train them in meditative, usually Vipassana, most often sort of the introductory type of way of just focusing attention and being present in a non-judgmental way. And there are multiple studies I've done where we implement this. And so we try to do it in a controlled way, so we understand that everyone's being exposed to the same instructions, the same amount of practice. And remarkably, it's remarkable to me, maybe not to other people where it doesn't surprise them. Remarkably, people, even with a small amount of training, we're talking maybe 6 or 8 weeks, can have a significant impact on their well-being, on their view of themselves. So their self-compassion, their compassion for other people, which translates into, when you talk to people, it translates into tolerance and forgiveness and all those positive things you can imagine that happen when you're compassionate towards yourself and other people. Anxiety is reduced, depressive symptoms are reduced. And this happens even if the person does not endorse that they had a mystical experience. So it's not like that has to happen. So I was really impressed with this because we first started looking at it with just a sort of an exposure study where we had students taking a course. It was an advanced course in Buddhism. And that course looked at the traditions, where all these modern traditions came from, and then the modern traditions. And then there was a lab, and the lab was really sort of a survey of these different adapted modern traditions. So very brief, a semester long. exposure. Just come do them in the lab, learn about them. And
that's about 6 weeks, you said?
Yeah. Well, no, this
And
one was longer. This was longer. This was a course, a semester, which is about 2.5 months.
Okay. And it's how many days a week and how many hours
so
a week?
So they're getting 2 courses, 2 lectures a week, each an hour. One is about the traditional origins, and one is about the modern adaptation. And then there's a 3rd hour of lab where they're actually doing the practices, and they're invited to do them in between.
Yeah.
But they're students, they're 20 somethings, so who knows?
Yeah.
And what we saw is, even in this sort of very modest exposure, we would call it, that there were significant changes, which doesn't seem like a big deal. However, it really, really is, because to get significant changes in that sort of a small amount of time with minimal effort, this was a course that you could give to anybody. And we see these sort of impacts on compassion towards each other, on reducing anxiety, improving depression, feeling just a better quality of life. To me, that's huge. So it makes me think, well, this is great, because think about, I would love to know how many people are using these kind of applications on their phone. These meditation apps, the mindfulness apps, they seem to have exploded, which in my mind can only be a good thing, because I've seen that, okay, just even some exposure, even if someone's only picking it up once a week and maybe doing a brief meditation or calming down, or doing a gratitude meditation, a compassion meditation, it may help. It may really help.
Wow. How long after the course finished was the first follow-up to find out that this had helped and these benefits? So
we measured it throughout, and unfortunately we didn't have the funding to do the longer term follow-up. So we only caught it at the very end. And so that's a good question of, what does this look like longer term?
Yeah.
In our other
studies, expect it would.
Right. In our other studies, we do see that it persists at least for about 2 months after, when we look. So obviously some of that depends on if the person continues to do the practices. And in many of our studies, what we try to do is use an app, so that it is, we sort of partner with an app. We most recently used Healthy Minds, which was from Richie Davidson out of Madison, Wisconsin. And the nice thing was that then we could provide that to them for free, and they could then have access to it and hopefully continue to practice.
Yeah. Because based on that, I guess it would be important that consistency, to continually do these practices, to continually reap the benefits.
At least at some level, and what many of them report is that they don't need to rely on that external app anymore, or intentionally setting aside time. Some of them do. They sort of build it into their pattern, their routine. Others, it really just becomes more of a moment-to-moment awareness. And I especially see that in my therapy patients. So I also see patients for therapy and do a lot of mindfulness-based interventions. Particularly effective is the therapy that's developed for people with more personality disorders. And this is the dialectical behavior therapy that Marcia Linehan developed. She's a psychologist, and it's got a very strong basis in Zen Buddhism, where you're helping someone who has a very unstable emotional response. So these are folks that sort of maybe what we would call overreact, but some of it has been a learned reaction. So they've been invalidated throughout their lives. So they've learned that, to get what they want, they really have to take it to this next level to get attention, to get their needs met. They have a lot of uncertainty about themselves because they've been invalidated. So it's like they don't trust themselves, but they also don't trust the authority or the outside person, because neither has been really helpful. And validating or trust, they don't trust. So in working with those patients, the DBT, the dialectical behavior therapy, has a very strong component of mindfulness. And what I noticed over the years, I've done this probably 20 years now, is that the participants would not only report that they were feeling better because their mood was more stable, their interpersonal relationships were more effective. What they also reported, and again, spontaneously, is that they were beginning to have more precognitions. They could, they saw what was, going to happen, and it happened. They had more coincidences. So these synchronicities were happening to them. They, and one woman even started to see auras around people, and they were willing to share with me because they knew me so well. We had done therapy for so long, but they were very, wondering, like, I don't know if I should tell my other doctors, this seems weird. But it was what we would think of as cities, these abilities that can come, it's in the literature, the ancient literature, that this is expected if you do these meditations or these practices long enough. You develop these abilities while you're in maybe this altered state of consciousness, and then even beyond. So many of these people just really were noticing remarkable things. I mean, enough that they would sort of voluntarily comment on it, which made me very fascinated. That's part of why I wanted to do the research and really began looking at it more from the research side.
Yeah. With the group of students, did any of them report similar things? And also, did any of them report like, transcendent experiences or a spiritual awakening type of things?
So unfortunately, we didn't ask those sorts of things. And there was really no opportunity for them to spontaneously report it. We didn't have the same sort of relationship where maybe they felt safe. And again, not an opportunity because we didn't ask. We were really trying to be careful because it is publicly funded university, and it was already sort of pushing it to do research in the classroom on a Buddhist course. So we were really trying to look at these others. And in some literatures, though, compassion is one of those extraordinary abilities. It's sort of in that bucket, if you will, with these other psi abilities, these psychic abilities, this precognition, compassion. I mean, that's sort of the sad state of humanity, that's considered an extraordinary ability.
Yeah, definitely. That's hopefully the most abundant of all of the psi elements, but I don't know.
And so we did look at social connection, so feeling connected to a larger a larger entity, and that increased, which was an interesting thing. And because we did really nothing else to try to inform that or try to change that, we see that consistently, that increase in a feeling of social connectedness and compassion for self and others. So they sort of go hand in hand. And yes, what wonderful, wonderful qualities. So you would hope they're in abundance, and unfortunately they're not, because we see significant improvements over time in our studies. But that means that we don't see really high levels at the beginning.
Why is this not a thing in schools, where children have to be taught how to do these practices and how to get the benefits from them?
Well, and along those lines, I have colleagues at the University of Virginia in the Contemplative Sciences Center. So we have a university-wide center that really is working on making accessible these sort of experiences. So yoga, meditation. And one of the studies in the recent years was looking at developing programming in the schools. And there again, it's interesting. In the United States, you have to be a bit careful because of the division between school and religion. If you're going into public school systems, you have to make it very sanitized. So it's got to be, it's not going to come with the Buddhist words and the spiritual, language. It will be more in that sort of sanitized, secularized language of mindfulness-based stress reduction or something. And so you do what you have to do. And yet I think that's still a really fascinating way to go about it, is to teach this at a very early age. And I think more and more you are seeing that, teaching emotional regulation, that you can sort of transform your state of mind yourself, that you can do this on your own. And those results have not come out yet. That was a large school. I believe they ended up doing it in Kentucky because of the challenges of trying to implement it in Virginia. So
you'd think that could have enormous benefits, right? For the world,
absolutely.
For humanity.
Well, I mean, and I know they are trying to implement it in places like prisons, to sort of help, again, give another sort of tool to individuals who may have challenges regulating emotion, or feeling validated, or feeling that sense of compassion for themselves and others, and feeling connected. So again, I think of these, the way I relate it to my work at the Division of Perceptual Studies is that these are shifts in consciousness. I mean, when we look also neurobiologically at what's happening in your brain, it is changing. It is over and over again, we see when we do the imaging, and I am not a neuroscientist. I am able to read the literature though. And what we do see is that it's almost like the opposite of what you might think. I think early on, the hypothesis was, when we're in this altered state of consciousness, it must be like, our brain's on fire and it's just firing off electricity everywhere. Connections are just being made, and like the organisms humming along. And what we find is really the exact opposite, is that it's like it shuts down. It's like the brain is getting out of the way, the physical brain, so that this is accessed, which I think is, to me, very intuitive. I think it's counterintuitive to some people who believe in a more physical approach to explaining things. To me, I am thinking, yes, that makes perfect sense, that you would sort of learn to say, calm it down, move it out of the way, so that you can access this other state of consciousness that is connected to something larger.
Yeah.
And that can be, beyond the physical death even. Yeah.
Which we'll talk a little bit more about very soon. And as well, before we talk maybe just briefly about consciousness, because you kind of led me into it there, I want to get your thoughts on that massive topic in brief. But before we do, have you got any kind of brief maybe advice or tips for people that want to engage in some meditation at home, or do some mindfulness practices or contemplative practices?
I think just start somewhere. And to me, as a psychologist, the most important thing is to do something that you will do again. Because I can imagine, the most effective, amazing sort of a treatment approach. And yet, if people won't do it, they don't have time, or it's too cumbersome, they're not going to. I tried the holotropic breathing, and I found it very effective and very hard for me to find time to do. It's very challenging. And so I don't do it that much, even though I know it's effective for me in reaching an altered state of consciousness. So I think really starting with whatever is accessible to you. If that is an app, there are lovely apps that Healthy Minds is one that I'm quite familiar with. And I think starting with something like that you can afford, that you can be curious about. You don't I'm a firm believer that you don't have to be trained in a certain way, or or have any kind of credentials. It's really about accessing that part of you that is connected to something bigger. So it can be through prayer, contemplative prayer, and many people who are religious may have already discovered that. It can be through nature. My mother really found her altered state of conscious, her happy place, her transcendental experiences in nature. And many modern day Wiccans may find that as well. And it can be through dance or song. Many people who are expressive artists, visual artists, physical artists, musical artists, that is a contemplative practice. So do what calls to you, I would say, and you will do it again and again, and that's how you will reach that.
Yeah. That's awesome. I mean, I guess the important bit is to feel like be in the present while you're doing that thing that you really enjoy.
You can be in the present, or you can even, get into that flow state, which is really, you are that. You are the music. You are, that is like the pure attention of present. That's pure presence, And I've even had one gentleman convince me that his mindful place was playing golf.
Now, why not? I guess. I don't think I can do it. Tell me, before we move on, you piqued my interest there with mentioning that you did some holotropic breathing, Stan Grof's holotropic breathing. Tell me, what that experience was like, or you've done it a few times, I gather. What were the experiences like? Have you had any kind of standout experience while experimenting with that?
A lot of it was visual, sort of, colors and changes in sort of perspective, sort of wavy, and a feeling of sort of just euphoria, I guess, is the best word. So very, very, like that calm euphoria of it's all good, it all makes sense, it's all right, it's all as it should be, which is, and that was really profound to be able to do it through the breathing. I've achieved that state sort of spontaneously in nature, sort of that awe experience, and generally am able to, access that through a sort of a vipassana meditation, or even a transcendental meditation, of just that sense of just profound, I don't know the words are hard, but just a profound rightness, but I think the breathing was more of a euphoria. It was more of that energized. Other is sort of a rightness, like it's all okay, like I can chill. That was more, like, woo, I'm jazzed, and
ecstasy, euphoria. Wow. Okay, let's jump into, like I just mentioned, consciousness. Obviously, it's a huge topic that we could discuss at length, but just kind of in brief, in a nutshell, maybe 5 minutes or so, just share with me what your thoughts are on that, whether you kind of subscribe to one of the theories that are out there. There's loads, obviously, or if you have kind of your own little theory, on things like, whether it's local, whether it's entirely non-local, whether it's fundamental to everything, like just kind of, riff on that for a minute, if you don't mind.
That's a big question, right?
Yeah.
I am the kind of person who enjoys studying and reading about things, and ultimately, when it comes down to it, goes back to trusting my own gut and my own sort of instinct. And so what I'm giving you is my gut and my instinct, because all of us can go and read about all the different theories, and I've got colleagues whom who can pontificate about that much more sophisticated ways than I can. But to me, it has always made sense, even as a very little girl, that it's such a waste if we are born, we have this soul or whatever. As a Christian, I was told it was a soul that was embodied in me, and that when I died, it went back to heaven. It seemed like such a waste to just sort of go back to heaven, and then no one could explain what happens there. It's just sort of up there, done, kaput, bye-bye.
Happily ever after.
Right. I just thought, well, that seems ridiculous and like quite a waste. And through early experiences, it was clear to me, this is sort of related, but a little tangential. Growing up on a farm in nature, spending a lot of time out there, sort of pressed against trees and the grass and in streams and with animals, it was clear to me they all had souls, that they all had this spark of consciousness. I wouldn't have called it consciousness then, but that they had something that I had also. And so I think you sort of take those two things, and in my child's mind, it was very clear that this all is part of one thing. And I still believe that. So I think, again, this is sort of rudimentary, but it may be the way that many people can access it and think about it, that there is this larger aspect of consciousness that is all encompassing. And we have an aspect of that within us embodied, as do other creatures, beings. And I would go so far as to say, why not a rock, a tree? We know that they communicate, so therefore it's all existing all the time. And when our physical body dies, when the tree is chopped down, it somehow is still part of the consciousness, is still part of that, and this is, again, my sort of simple view that is expounded in more complicated research and theories. I have found, though, over time, just in talking to hundreds of people, that this is a language that they can understand and potentially resonate with if they're able to be open-minded enough to think about it.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, though. It's fascinating. And obviously we don't know. Nobody knows as much as some people claim that they do or that they think they do. It's speculation is the best we can do, based on, obviously, reading and research and other people's experiences and maybe experiences that we've had ourselves. But yeah, thank you for sharing. Psi phenomena, psychic phenomena. Again, kind of similar question, really. I just want to hear your thoughts on it, but I guess we'll start off with, it's real, right? Is it real?
I mean, I think we've proven in the research that, precognition is real. I mean, statistically, it occurs at rates that would be, that have been documented. I think if you talk to anyone who's personally experienced it, they would tell you it was real. And many people sort of ascribe to that old adage that if you prove one example of it existing, then it's real, because there's at least one example. So I would say yes. And I would say it is an extension of this larger overall aspect of consciousness that we just really don't have a firm understanding of yet. And, I think it's really interesting. I love reading about history and the change in cultures over time. And I think our cultures generally, in the westernized cultures today, we have much more difficulty with ambiguity than or uncertainty or unknowns than in the past. I mean, and one of the things that I try to keep in mind is it's okay to not know. And in the past, that was quite common to be, just to be like, well, oh, it happened. No one can explain why. Okay.
Yeah.
Just go along, For instance, there was this wonderful story about the Midwest in the US where it was, I think from the 1800s, meat just fell out of the sky, like raw meat. And the farmers just gathered it and just accepted it like whatever, meat falling from the sky. They tried to eat it, but it was not good. And so then they decided it wasn't even fit to feed the animals. So they, just let it rot or threw it away or something. But, it's this story about did they do anything about it? No. Did they report it? I think they reported it to some local sheriff or something, but nothing was, they were able to just be like, well, that happened, whatever. Okay.
Gift from the gods, right? Or something.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I think sometimes it can be really beneficial to remember these are questions that we can certainly investigate and explore and be open to. And I myself do that, and I'm excited about it, and I love to learn. And yet that maybe we are not able to comprehend all of this yet. Maybe we never will be. And I'm okay with that because I think it's wonderful just to explore and to think about it and to expand my mind. And do I believe that psychic abilities are a certain thing or created a certain way, or, I have no idea. I can have some theories, and we can do research. I think some of these aspects, we just don't have the tools really to measure right now either.
Yeah.
So it's hard to find something, even if it's there, if you don't have the right tool or the technology to really understand it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Or like you said a minute ago, maybe we don't actually have the brain, as in like the actual organ. Maybe it doesn't have the capacity to understand all of this stuff, however it fits into overall reality. Like maybe it's just too much for our simple human brains to really grapple with what is out there.
And maybe when we're released from that brain, we may have more access.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is nice to think about,
Yeah.
But yeah, that would go in line with what, my colleagues typically call the filter theory, that what we can access is sort of filtered through this physical thing called our brain. And we can certainly alter the way it operates in that we can change, through meditation or psychedelic drugs or other ways we can change our state of consciousness. But we can't totally get rid of the hardware.
No, we're kind of stuck with that for now until, like you say, we pass.
Yeah.
Which we're going to talk about in a second. Just before we leave Psi, I just wanted to. Do you think, again, I know it's speculation, but do you think that this is something everybody has the ability to do? Or do you think it's kind of just in select individuals? And do you think like there are limits? Obviously, we don't know them yet, but would you assume there would be limits to what people can do with this?
My suspicion, and again, it's just sort of a hunch based on my intuition, is that we would all have an aspect of this. It would be like any characteristic on a continuum. And so like any continuum, you have some who have very minimal and some moderate and some quite a lot. And that may explain the differences we see. The limits, I would suspect are just like we talked about, limited by our physical equipment, potentially. However, if we talk about if we can make our mind that like we were talking about in meditation, if we can sort of get it out of the way, or whatever the impediments are, get them out of the way, then potentially it could be more. And I don't know what the future holds either. So will we become increasingly augmented in ways that in sort of increase our ability to access this higher level of consciousness, or will the increase in technological augmentation reduce that, or produce some sort of artificial version of it?
It's a fascinating question.
It is a very interesting topic, and one that I would love to explore more. I read this wonderful book about and now I can't remember it. It's about a woman. She was a sociologist who was invited to go to Australia to one of the indigenous tribes, and they were honoring her for the work she had done and sort of helping understand their culture. And she was embedded with them. They sort of did this honorary walkabout with her. So she had to abandon all her possessions and go with them. And what she realized is that they all were communicating without words to each other, without, verbal signals, and that they had this kind of telepathy.
Yeah.
A genuine telepathy. And they said, of course they did. This was not weird to them. And she said, well, why can't we all do this? What is going on? And they said, oh, you obviously have to be together for a while and know each other, and you can't lie. You can't be false, tell falsehoods, because it won't work. And so it makes me think, okay, what ancient cultures like this one in Australia may have had these telepathic connections, which would make perfect sense. Perfect sense, that we have replaced now through cell phones, through, a constant augmentation of a cell phone with us. So now we can communicate. And maybe we've had that ability all along. We're now just replacing it. So that's why I'm not 100% sure technology will augment our ability to access these altered states of consciousness, or this larger expanded consciousness, or if they will sort of be sort of a technological parallel type thing. But I thought that was really fascinating. What abilities do we have built in that we've just sort of let wither away,
Yeah, definitely. That is fascinating. And you're right. What innate human things do we have within us that we've just totally forgotten about? And maybe it's a case of, I think you've probably come across this quite a bit as well, like if you have to believe that it's possible in order to be able to do it, or to pick up some of this stuff. So maybe there's a big degree of that, is that we're totally, it's the worldview, isn't it, that none of this stuff is possible and that it's fantasy. And so obviously the vast majority of us don't grow up thinking it's possible to be that, have kind of precognition of something happening in the future, or to communicate without normal means with somebody else, or whatever it might be, to see something in a place that you can't visually see. We grow up thinking all that stuff is totally impossible. Whereas maybe if we were brought up to realize, okay, so actually it is possible under certain circumstances, maybe there'd be so much more reports of all this. And maybe there are people that experienced it as well, that just put it down to something else, that just assume, it's coincidence, or just a lucky guess, or, things like that. It probably happens all the time, right?
Yeah. It's so interesting to think about.
Yeah, all of it is. If you remember the name of that book, by the way, let me know, and I'll try and kind of put it in the description or put it on screen, because that does sound fascinating.
Yeah.
So you mentioned at the start of our conversation about your work, your research into like psychology at the end of life, like when people are coming towards the end of their earthly life, their consciousness and things like that. And you said you spent time around their families. I'd love it if you could talk a little bit more about your time researching that, and just all of it in general, but kind of, how consciousness or conscious experience changes as we get nearer to the end of our lives. Or I suppose in your research, it's mostly when people know that they're nearing the end of their life. Obviously, it's different if somebody suddenly dies. But yeah, please talk about that a little bit.
Yes, and I think it's actually it's a nice segue from what we were discussing to the present time, because I think the whole dying process is quite different in modern days than it has been in the past, and certainly in the distant past of our indigenous people, where there were expectations, first of all, that you will die. I mean, many people today feel it's almost like an affront to them that they would die. And so just comprehending death, we know humans have, there's a theory called terror management theory in psychology that, part of why dying is so hard is because as humans, we are conscious, we're aware that we will have that. And yet our ego makes us feel like we are immortal. So there's this huge conflict and perhaps, like we've talked about, there is this knowing of an aspect of us that is immortal, which is that larger connected component, and that the physical body will die. So it makes sense to me that there would be this conflict. And terror management theory talks about there's really then just two ways to handle this, if this approaching fear of death and dying. One is denial, which works short term, avoid that anxiety by and I see a lot of that. Patients, do whatever it takes. We'll work hard. We'll get this better. Fight the cancer and you'll win. And then the other is through some way of accommodating it into your worldview. And the theory is that in the distant past, the cultures, all of the rituals would be part of this, and the myths, the beliefs, the spirituality, the religion even would be a way of saying, here's what happens. So here's how we accommodate it, make sense of it, and understand it. And that reduces the terror. So I think it's important to understand that, because many people have never heard of terror management theory or this whole body of work. And when I'm working with patients and their families, you often see some difficulty in approaching the understanding of physical death. And so many of the people I work with these days don't even have sort of that religious underpinning that may have helped. It's really about trying to help them find a way to access this sort of open-mindedness, if you will, this sort of ability to say, well, what does this mean? How will I accommodate this into my worldview? And often that means I have to help them shift their state of consciousness, because it's hard to access that different way of thinking when you're so rigidly entrenched in where you are now. So this is where I think that a meditative practice, a contemplative practice, often I try to encourage them, whatever may help them have this sort of spiritual awakening, and connect with that, like reconnect if they've sort of left that somewhere with a spiritual practice or religion, or come back to it, or develop one if they never had it, if they've been purely agnostic. And so a lot of times it is sort of finding what will help them expand, and it's profound when it happens. And this also, we've not been able to do the research on this, but this is also the theory why psychedelic drugs would work, to sort of open up that space and that view of that altered consciousness, because it's then, and for some that may be enough, because they had a very profound, meaningful experience that often happens with the psychedelics in the literature you see, or through the meditative experience. they have a mystical sort of experience, and that sometimes is enough to shift. They feel connected, that they feel they have a better understanding of how to incorporate death. And sometimes it's just the beginning, where then the work is more therapeutic and sort of integrating what that experience was like. What does that mean? How can they translate that into approaching the end of their physical body? And for many of them, it is literally a discussion that they've never had with anyone.
Yeah.
You know, what does it mean to you to know your physical body will die? How can, have you ever thought about it? Have you ever, do you have a religious tradition you were brought up in, or do you have your own ideas from your own experience? Yeah. And many of them have never had anyone just have a frank conversation about that.
No, it's not something we do a lot, is it, in our cultures?
Mm-mm.
It's kind of a bit of a taboo. It's like people are, I guess, afraid to ask, or afraid of the answers, or I don't know. It's a bit of both, I suppose.
Yes, I think you're right.
Maybe afraid of upsetting the person as well.
Well, they certainly don't always feel comfortable doing this with their family, because often the family is in denial, saying, no, mom's not going to die. She's going to fight harder, and the doctors are going to do more. And so often they won't open up and explore that with them. So it really can be helpful to have another person. Yeah.
Do you, in your experience with this, have you noticed like any big differences depending on factors such as age of the person that's dying, or their religion, or any other factors at all? Like, do you notice any particular correlations there? Like, younger people are much more open to this, or I don't know.
I haven't really. I think,
interesting.
And maybe that's because I don't know, because my sample is sort of homogeneous. I don't know, but even the young people I've seen young people who really were very rigid and very materialistic and very much grieving because they were just accepting that death is done over. I'm finished. And that was devastating. And then I've had older people who were much more open-minded and flexible. And so it's sort of gone it's really very, very individual. And so,
but are there any universal elements to it, like where regardless of age, gender, whatever, when people get really close to the end, is there some things? I mean, we can talk about end of life experiences in a minute, but just in general, in terms of maybe things that happen a bit before the end, is there any universal correlation that you can put your finger on?
Correlation between what?
Just between, like, I guess when they're getting closer to passing away, and maybe certain changes in personality or their outlook, or how they're communicating their thoughts, or anything along these lines, really, their attitude.
Yeah, again, it's difficult for me to say that there are, trends or certain things correlate with other things, because I've just seen such variability. And I will say, I think people who have approached instead of denied, I mean, that's one thing I can clearly say. If people are still in that denial component, it is very difficult, and they have what we call sort of a difficult death. And there's often a lot more drama, a lot more medications, a lot more interventions, and that can be very traumatizing for the family who are witnessing this, and yet they're often the ones pushing for it. So, I think when a person has reached a place where they've reached this sort of consciousness level of making it, accommodating the death, that they've understood how this will fit into their worldview, whatever that is. And to me, they've expanded their consciousness, they've allowed this in, and they've made a place for it. And that looks different for each person.
Yeah.
When they've done that, then that allows them individually, I think, to have a good death. And I don't know, we'll never know this. Will that help them in that transition wherever they're going? Some of the ancient literature, in my readings of Emanuel Swedenborg, is, that we sort of create that next level of consciousness we go to after our death. And I like to think maybe I'm helping them through that journey, not just here, wherever they pass on to.
Yeah, absolutely. You said that some people, when they're still in denial, they have like a more difficult death. Do you think that's because they're fighting against dying a lot harder than maybe somebody who's kind of accepted it more and is less afraid of what's about to happen?
Yes. Yeah. I think they're fighting it physically by getting more interventions that are, more painful, and they're also fighting it in their mind, and never finding a place for it, never feeling like they've accommodated it, like they've accepted it. And that's really, really hard to see. That I get very emotional with that, because it's very challenging to see someone fighting against sort of the reality and being so close-minded and rigid right until they die. It's just really, really hard to watch.
Yeah, I can imagine. It would be very, very difficult. Have you ever had somebody that had kind of along those lines, in denial and kind of struggling with the whole thing? Have you ever had somebody in that mindset that has then had an end of life experience, or experienced kind of terminal lucidity, or anything that fits under those sort of?
No, unfortunately not.
Tell me about then some of the people that have been a bit more accepting and that haven't been in denial, and the experiences that they've had, maybe that you've dealt with.
Well, I mean, I think of multiple people where we really had some work in accommodating it. They were open, they were very confused, they obviously very conflicted about dying. Many people are ready to go. I think of one gentleman in particular, and yet knew that his family wasn't ready for him to go. And this, so we ended up sort of talking with him for a bit and really helping him accommodate this. He had a belief that he was open to sort of entering a connected sort of global consciousness. That was sort of where he landed, and felt good about that. And it ended up, he wanted to bring his family in and help them understand how he was approaching it. And because of the seriousness of it all and everything, I mean, they listened and they understood, and there were a lot of very emotional tears, and they were tears of joy that he had shared this with them, that his understanding, that they could hopefully know that this is where he was in his approach to it, and to let him do that. And I think that knowing that helped them. And of course, I've in this area of the world, I still find many people who it's very important to them to have, that relationship with their God, and reconfirm to that. So along with my work, they want to recommit to, their religious faith, and bring religious leaders in and help them do that, and assure them. And it really is that, again, that accommodation. They want assurance. This is what I believe. Bring someone in to tell me, yes, that's, sanctioned or whatever. And so it's a very similar thing, just in a more structured religion component of and sharing that again with the family. And that can be, it can be difficult when you see conflict there as well. A family who says, oh, he has to believe in Jesus, and we have to make sure he tells us that before he goes, or he'll go to hell. So the family is pushing for this. The patient is like, no, I don't need to do that. I don't want to do that. That can be very challenging, as you can imagine. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Let's move forward a little bit, and I'd ask you if you can talk to me about your work with spontaneous after-death communications. So I think that's fascinating, obviously.
Yes, it is. And that's really quite recent, in the past, I'd say 3 or 4 years, of become very interesting to me. As you can see, I sort of follow what I'm doing in my career, my clinical career. So in this work that I've been doing with patients in the cancer center, I would begin to hear stories from family, from even my patients, about these communications that they were having. And I myself had, I guess you would call it an after-death communication. It's sort of a version of that. Pretty profound. I'm happy to share if you want. But
that would be great. I'd love to hear
but
it.
My interest really came from that, from hearing people report this and then seeing the positive impact on them. So grieving patients, really grappling with grief. We're really trying to work through that. And then they have this spontaneous communication from the loved one. And it's like, it's just amazing how quickly then the affect changes. They feel this sort of shift. It's almost palpable. So I had one woman in particular, very challenging relationship with her mother, who passed away, and really grieving what we would call complicated bereavement. So we're talking years later. She was going between over idolizing her mother, who was really not the most wonderful mother, and then totally rejecting, and it was perpetuating this horrible grief. And we, in order to sort of help stabilize her mood, I worked with her on meditation and teaching her meditation. And then several, I think, months into it, she came and reported this profound communication from her mother, where she literally felt the touch of her mother, and this overwhelming sense of relief. And she called it forgiveness, which is interesting. She was never clear if it was her mother forgiving her or her forgiving her mother, but it was this sense of like release and acceptance, and very strong. She said it was absolutely my mother. It was her touch. It was her. I think she had the aroma. It was her presence, and she was letting it go. It was like I'm making peace, and that was it. It was gone. This grief was gone. It was pretty amazing. Now, was some of it augmented by the work we had done? Sure. And yet this was really sort of the final thing that I think needed to happen. So I've seen that, and it's been really, really powerful. My own experience is different. And you might think of it more like a ghost in some ways.
An apparition.
I was with my mother, who I was very close to. And I was a young adult in my 20s. She and I were at the beach, and for some reason it was just the two of us. And this is like the Atlantic Ocean beach in North Carolina. And we were laying on the sand, and she, I had a towel over my face because it was really hot. And she said she was going to get in the water. She went to go swim. And I'm sure I fell asleep. I woke up to a commotion, like many voices. And so I got up on my elbows, and I looked, and it was a big group of people in the water. And I couldn't really tell what was going on, but I just sort of sat there. And then as they sort of moved up through the water onto the sand, I could see a lifeguard and this other older gentleman pulling my mother out of the water. And for whatever reason, I was very calm. It was clear she was going to be okay. And I stayed put because it was a big crowd. And I was just like, well, she's making her way here. She seems to be fine. I saw her communicating with the lifeguard who, was checking her out. And then she walked over and I got up and she said, no, lay down. I'm fine. I'm fine. And we laid down. And she said, I just need to lay down and dry out. And so I laid down beside her. We both closed our eyes. And I said, Mom, what happened? And she said, well, I got caught in a rip current and it was pulling me out and stronger than I thought, because she's a good swimmer. And she said, and they just had to pull me in, and thankfully they did. And I said, well, I saw the lifeguard, but who was that other older man? And she said, oh, you saw him too? And I said, yeah, what do you mean? She said, well, that was my grandfather. And I had never met him. It was her grandfather, so my great-grandfather. And we both saw him. And the backstory is, I did not learn until much later. That's all she said. And that's all we talked about it. Didn't talk about it again. After she died, her best friend, who grew up with her, went to nursing school with her, all of this, practiced with her. I had many long talks with her as part of my grief of saying goodbye to my mother. And she filled me in on some more of my mother's life. So my mother had a fairly tumultuous childhood and was primarily raised by her grandparents. And her grandfather was especially fond of her. Mm. He gave her the name Peaches, and was just very, very doting on her and supportive of her. She was an only child. And so I also found pictures of him, which I could recognize because I had seen him. And that was a pretty big shocker for me. Like, oh my God, yep, that's him. Flip it over. Okay, all right. So, I don't know what to make of that, other than he came and saved my mother at a time when she was probably in a state of consciousness that accessed something bigger. I mean, this is really how I think of it. Mm-hmm. When you're nearly dying, you're drowning or think you're drowning.
Yeah.
The state of mind you're in, I can only imagine. She had practiced transcendental meditation, was very, like I said, very spiritual. She would have been a Wiccan if she'd known what that was. And I think it opened up a way for him to come to her. And perhaps because of my connection, my openness, I also saw him. And it'd be curious. I would love to know, did other people see him? Did some people? Did others not? Some did.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be fascinating to be able to find out. Wouldn't it be absolutely fascinating?
But I certainly did. And I mean, because it was so curious. I mean, it clearly stuck out in my memory. So
do you remember at the time when you were seeing that, did he just look like a normal person?
Yeah.
You didn't think at the start, like, this is something bizarre I'm seeing, or just look like everybody else?
I did remember noticing he seemed to be like, he was in, khaki, sort of baggy khaki pants and a short sleeve white button up shirt. And this looked a bit odd, I mean, but not extraordinarily odd for an older person to be wearing, maybe.
Yeah. It wasn't glowing or anything like that, like exuding light.
No, and you have to remember also, they're walking through waves that are flashing, and there are people around. So it didn't look, it looked like, oh gosh, and the main thing I remember is, like, an older gentleman. Why couldn't some of those young men have gone out there? What's going on? So that was
I
the
suppose you
only.
don't remember in enough detail to see to remember if the waves were actually like hitting on
Yeah,
his
no, I
legs, or it
don't.
just
I
kind of
don't, because it was, at
yeah,
that
a
point, it was
blur, I
like
imagine.
my
Yeah,
mind is trying to
yeah,
compute. Number one, is that my mother? And what's
yeah,
happening?
yeah, yeah. Of course, where it's overload of
Yeah.
information at that moment.
What I do remember though is I really, like I said, I didn't go run to her. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I had
Felt
this
calm.
profound sense that it was all okay,
Mm,
that I didn't need to do anything. And that was a pure emotion of sort of equanimity. It's all fine. It's all just
yeah,
be calm, be still.
yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. And you have obviously had lots of time to reflect upon that, and I'm sure you've kind of questioned yourself about it lots of times, and you've really tried to, yeah, I guess look at it from every different angle, and you're absolutely convinced that that's what it was.
Yeah. Now, I'm not convinced that it was a real physical man
No.
that
Yeah.
would,
Yeah.
bleed if you poked him or something. I think it
Yeah.
was some representation that
Mm.
manifest through this connection she had and this state of mind she was in. Do I
Yeah.
think this would have happened if she was just strolling along the beach? No. So I think it was that component
Mm.
of her altered state, and perhaps even mine. I mean, you know how you can be in sort of a hypnagogic state when you're in the sun. I do remember I had been lying there drowsy, very relaxed, very much floating out of myself, just like you do when you're in the sun on the beach. Your face is covered, you're blissful, but you're not asleep. So that, I, from my scientific mind, this is where I go, not shutting it down as like, oh, it was a hallucination. I think of it as, oh, my mind might have been, my consciousness state might have been amenable to this. Hers certainly
Mm.
would have been. And this manifest.
Yeah.
Um, and we
Wow.
both accessed it. And to me, that
Mm.
I will argue with anyone, that makes sense to me. So
Yeah, I mean, it's. I guess it's basically a shared crisis apparition, right?
yes,
You could
we
kind
would
of
call it
put it
that.
in that box.
Certainly. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, wow, no, that is fascinating. Thank you for sharing that, Kim. I
Oh,
appreciate it because,
I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled that I was honored to have that connection, and
yeah,
that I was included in that, um, with her. I mean, that's a bond
yeah,
I will have, and a an experience I just always remember, and it's given me really great comfort. So I can
mm,
really relate to people who have these after death communications. I mean, it is profound, and it does give you comfort. And I think the most recent research we did, and this is with a group that's over there, in Europe. Evelyn Elsevier and David Lorimer is involved, and others, Chris Rowe and Callum Cooper. Um, they did the heavy lifting of really implementing the survey and collecting a lot of the data in Europe, and we collected the data in the US. And what we found is really many more people have these experiences than we might realize.
mm,
We could say roughly half, and in widows and widowers, it's even higher.
wow,
And these are just the people that are voluntarily stepping forward. It's not even the, going and ferreting out everyone and asking everybody. So the numbers may be higher. But what we find is across the board, the vast majority of people find these very comforting.
mm,
It in not only reducing their grief over the loss, but also increasing their belief in something after death, in increasing their spirituality, not necessarily their religiosity, but their spirituality, their belief in spirituality, and their belief that once we die, we can still communicate. And that's augmented. It is especially true for the people who have some sort of more a salient sort of contact. So a physical touch, like the patient I described, multiple occurrences, which also makes sense. It's sort of like repeated exposure, or some other physical sort of manifestation. So not just a sense of the presence of someone, but, seeing them, feeling them, that sort of thing.
Yeah. I'm sure you've had instances like where when somebody dies and somebody else is not aware of the death, and then they have a kind of crisis apparition situation, which then they kind of make a phone call and find out, this person just passed away at the exact same moment that they appeared to them, and things like that, which is obviously incredibly evidential. But it's fascinating. And lots of the way you describe it, it sounds like you could be describing NDEs as well, in the sense of how people react to that and kind of the changes that can make in mentality and things like that.
Yes.
So I'm getting towards the end of my time with you. We've probably got another, 10 minutes or so. So I want to make the most of it. So I think we'd both agree that the best evidence for the survival of consciousness is just the amount of evidence in all the different areas. But if you could kind of pinpoint one, if you could highlight one kind of, I don't really know how to word this, but one kind of area of survival evidence that would be the strongest evidence for survival. It's a very complicatedly worded sentence, but do you see what I'm getting at? Which kind of facet for you would be the most compelling?
I've not worded it that way in my head. However, I think there's two kinds of evidence. So the world I work in right now is more the evidence of the impact and the outcomes. And I think that's very strong. I think that helps enrich humans. I think, though, if we are talking about pure science evidence where we can say to skeptics, like, here's some proof, I do wonder if it might not be the children who remember past lives, because in that research that Jim Tucker does at the division, there is, this sort of evidence that's hard to refute when someone reports something that they could not possibly know unless they had lived that life. To me, just the fact that we have any of those cases that have been documented and supported in the literature, it leads towards proof there, and in a way that I think most people can grasp, even if you're a pure materialist or, really rigidly following the scientific method. I think you have to look at that and say, how else would that happen? I mean, now it could happen that the child is psychic and picking up on some information from somewhere or accessing some consciousness. We're not really fussing about the mechanism, though. We're sort of talking about, is it real or not?
And it seems like, if when you really look at it and you look at some of the strongest cases, it does seem that the most likely explanation for it would be that what they're saying has happened, right? I mean, obviously, there's no guarantee, and we can't prove it beyond any doubt at all. But it does seem like the most likely, the most logical, the most rational explanation.
If you're using Occam's razor that the scientists love so much.
Exactly. So again, after we die, again, let's kind of, we're going to do basically quick fire, I guess, from here on out, just so I can kind of cram in as many little things as possible. Just answer in a nutshell if you can. So when we die, and again, they're huge questions, pretty much all of them, and huge topics, but we're going to do what we can.
Oh, thanks.
Good luck. So when we die, do we retain our personality, our memories, or do we kind of melt back into a universal consciousness? What do you think?
I think somewhere in between, a little of all of that.
Yeah. Okay. That's fair enough. I'll give you that. I like that. This one is probably a much longer answer that I did want to ask you. I don't know whether you can kind of answer it in a sentence or two if you have something in mind already, but if you had like unlimited budget and resources and manpower or human power and time and everything, would you have like a parapsychological experiment that you would do, like the kind of the dream experiment to prove whatever you want to prove? If you haven't got something off the top of your head, don't worry, and we can kind of carry on with the quick fire. But I just wanted to ask you.
I think it would be so many things, on so many fronts. Because again, my agenda would be not only to explore; it would be to see the impact. I really am interested in how does this help humanity and the world, and so. I will say quickly, it would be to look at, can we build communities that actually demonstrate compassion for each other, for the world, in a way that is sustainable? Like John Lennon wanted,
Yeah. I'll see if I can get you that funding, that unlimited funding and time and everything. Okay, so we did kind of just touch on children with past life memories. That was going to be something I was going to ask you about. NDs, OBs. I mean, I think I know where you can kind of stand on that. Give me a minute on psychedelics. Just talk for a minute on psychedelics and how they kind of relate to these topics we've talked about.
Absolutely.
Today. Again, we've touched on them a few times. You've mentioned them, right. But we haven't really gone into it.
So this is the next area I hope to begin exploring more. I've just finished a 10-month course in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, and that was really lovely and intense, and looking at MDMA, psilocybin, and ketamine, and the uses in the psychotherapeutic interventions, which again are becoming more and more prevalent. And I really conceptualize it as this way of, again, altering our consciousness. And if you look at the psychotherapy, psychedelic psychotherapy assisted components, they're really focused on that. This is exactly that. It's sort of creating this space and time and opportunity for this expanded state of consciousness, potentially accessing some transformational emotion or visions or state, transcendent mystical state, which then allows you to do the work of healing, the therapeutic integration and moving along to sort of help. So I see it as akin to, a contemplative practice you might use, meditation, learning meditation, that sort of thing, sort of another strategy, another tool in our toolbox to alter consciousness, to allow to move into these spaces of therapeutic healing. And again, I want to honor the fact that these have been in indigenous cultures forever, in very ritualized ways and very spiritual ways, and that we are now in the modern world taking them and sometimes acting like we obviously know Leary did it, but we are sort of like, don't take it back further than that. So I think understanding this has been part of what humans have done from the beginning. Contemplative practices, dancing, chanting, taking medicines, natural medicines, and altering our state of consciousness. And to me, that's additional evidence that we can do this. This is sort of a natural state that we want to be able to access.
Yeah. Brilliant. I would talk to you more about what you just said because it was great, but I just want to run through these. So spoon bending is something that, we talked earlier about Psi. We talked about potential limits of Psi. This is something that lots of reputable people seem to talk about. And then also there's lots of people that, it seems hard to accept. Have you got any thoughts on it? Have you ever seen it being done? Have you talked to anybody that's done it? What do you think?
I've never done it. I have seen the evidence of what some of my colleagues have done. I would be totally up for trying. I've just never had the opportunity. So I really don't know what to make of it. I'm sort of open. I wish I knew more about all kinds of things like physics and theoretical physics and advanced particle physics. And I don't know that I'll ever get there. But I would love to have that knowledge. I'd love to bring the physicists and spoon benders in and let's talk about it. Let's talk about why it might work, why it might not. What is it about? I have no idea. I'd love to know.
We might find the gap where those two things don't meet is the bit that we talked about earlier, like our capacity to understand.
Yeah.
What about mediumship? Just 30 to 60 seconds on mediumship?
Yes. I mean, to me, it's possible that, again, that these are individuals who have either learned or a natural ability to sort of shut down their brain and set it aside and let themselves get into this altered state of consciousness where they access this information. And I'm sure there's plenty of people who put themselves out there as mediums and are just very good readers of people, which is a skill, a very laudable skill in and of itself, and may not be accessing anything supernatural or at a higher level. And there's probably some that are. How do you tell the difference? I mean, I think Ed Kelly's trying to work on that,
Yeah, and the Windbridge have done a lot of work on that too.
Yeah.
The Windbridge, so there's lots of work out there on that. I'm going to talk to Ed more about that next time as well. Pretty much the last thing I'll ask you, I'm going to have to leave a few things like on the table. Maybe we'll get to them next time we talk. But the last thing I'll ask you really is just to spend just a minute or two to tell us about the book that you wrote with your daughter, just briefly.
Oh, yes. So my daughter, Morgan, she and I spent much of COVID writing our book together, which is Living Mindfully Across the Lifespan, an Intergenerational Guide. And we did this because we wanted to work together, and she is studying psychology. She's also a yoga instructor and meditation instructor. And we really wanted something that was handy for people to read and access the same things that we talk to people about over and over again as a psychologist and a yoga instructor, meditation instructor. And so we included a lot of the practices we recommend for people to use. We included a lot of stories from ourselves, and we included the perspective from a Gen X, which is my generation, and a millennial, or whatever they're called now, which is hers. And it really sort of wove it with psychology and some of this sort of newer contemplative practice psi type things. For instance, the story of my encounter with my great-grandfather is in the last chapter, which is called So Long for Now, ? So it spans the lifespan as well. So we begin with sort of issues in early childhood all the way through to death. And it's quite unique, I think. We really had a lot of fun.
Yeah, cool. Well, I'll put the link in the description to that. And as I said, we'll try and get you back on with your daughter to talk more about that book in the future. So this will be the very last thing I'll ask you, is just if you want to leave any kind of last words, some words of wisdom, if you just want to share anything with people watching or listening, the floor is yours.
Absolutely. I think if you're listening, I hope that you took this with an openness and you really explore yourself, your own inner wisdom, and allow that to be open and aware and see where it takes you in your contemplative journey. I think we all have this within us. If we listen to our inner wise self, we are usually guided to where we need to go. So I hope everyone, if nothing else, they take away that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Kim. This was awesome. I really enjoyed this, and you're a fascinating person to talk to, and I really appreciate you sharing your personal stories as well. And I look forward to doing it again.
Well, thank you. Be well.
Thanks. Thank you, Kim. You too.
Thank you for listening to my conversation with Kim Penberthy. I hope you enjoyed it and took as much from it as I did. Please see the description for Kim's links, our links, a reading list inspired by the interview, and much more. Please consider subscribing to continue unraveling the universe with us, and maybe even contemplate contributing via Patreon. Thank you.